On a night when the Wyoming blizzard swallowed everything in white silence, Farmer Ethan Miller stumbled upon a sight that stopped his breath. Two wild horses, chained and half-buried in the snow, their eyes burning with fear. He thought rescuing them was just an act of mercy. But what followed would unravel scars, awaken secrets, and lead to a bond so powerful it could either heal or destroy everything he had left. The storm had settled over Wyoming like a heavy quilt, pressing down on the valley until even the silence seemed muffled. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that scoured the land raw, piling white drifts against the fences and burying the narrow gravel roads that wound between ranch houses miles apart. Ethan Miller drove slowly, his old Chevy truck whining in protest as it crawled up the hill toward home. The wipers slapped a rhythm that matched the hollow ache in his chest. Nights like these had never frightened him, but they had a way of pulling at old wounds, opening places in him that he'd tried to stitch shut years ago. A sudden sound broke through the monotony of the storm. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, a high-pitched whistle weaving between the trees. But then it came again, sharper, rawer, something closer to a scream than a cry. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The lights caught movement in the snow, not the natural sway of pine branches, but something thrashing, desperate. Ethan eased the truck onto the shoulder, the tires crunching in the powder, and cut the engine. When he opened the door, the wind slapped him full in the face, stealing the air from his lungs. He tugged his wool cap lower, zipped his coat tight, and stepped out, boots sinking to the ankle in snow already beginning to crust with ice. The sound came again, clearer now. The harsh grunt of an animal, followed by the frantic whinny that sent a shiver crawling up his spine. He moved toward it, hand raised to shield his eyes from the swirling flakes. The shapes appeared first as shadows, blurred by the storm. Then, step by step, they sharpened into form. Two horses lay tangled near a half-buried fence post, their bodies heaving, chains biting into their legs. One was a pale gray, coat dulled by frost, the other a deep chestnut that gleamed even beneath the snow. Their sides rose and fell in uneven rhythm, steam bursting from their nostrils in desperate plumes. The chains rattled as they pulled against them, panic written in every muscle. Ethan stopped, breath clouding in front of him. He'd seen abandoned animals before, dogs tied to posts at rodeo grounds, cats dropped by highways, but nothing like this. Horses weren't strays you could leave behind. They were wild in spirit, heavy in presence, creatures born to run. To see them brought to this, shackled in the heart of a snowstorm, felt like cruelty sharpened to a knife's edge. "Easy there," he said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. It wasn't much, just a scrap of sound offered to calm them, though he knew words meant nothing to their ears. The gray horse's head jerked toward him, eyes wide and liquid, and the chestnut flung itself sideways, snow spraying like shattered glass. Ethan raised his hands, palms outward, keeping his steps measured. The military had taught him patience in moments like this. Never rush, never spook, never let your own fear run ahead of you. He knelt, squinting at the hardware. The chains were thick, looped with heavy padlocks, anchored to a stake hammered deep into frozen ground. This wasn't some accident. Someone had put them here, deliberately, leaving them to either freeze or starve. His chest tightened with a heat he hadn't felt in months. Anger, sharp and clean, cutting through the numbness that usually ruled his nights. Snow stung his cheeks as he circled the horses, searching for a way to free them. His truck was close, but he didn't have tools for this. No bolt cutters, no hacksaw. Even if he could break the locks, the animals were too weak to bolt, yet too dangerous to handle bare-handed. A single kick from the chestnut's hind legs could split a man's ribs. He thought of leaving, driving back to fetch tools, but one look at their trembling bodies, and he knew they wouldn't last another hour out here. His gaze fell to his pocket. A simple apple, left over from lunch. He pulled it free, held it out, and waited. Minutes stretched like wire. The gray horse's nostrils flared, head lowering inch by inch. The sound of teeth crunching into the fruit felt louder than the storm itself. For the first time that night, Ethan exhaled fully, a breath that carried more than just air. It carried relief, and something softer he couldn't yet name. The chestnut remained wild-eyed, foam at the corners of its mouth, but its gaze flicked to the gray, then back to Ethan. A choice lingered there, unspoken. Ethan tore off another piece of apple, held it steady, and whispered, "It's all right. I'm not leaving you here." Behind him, the storm howled harder, as if daring him to prove it. He didn't turn back. The snow deepened around his boots, the night thickened with cold, and still he stayed, hand outstretched, waiting for the impossible moment when trust might begin again. The apple's crunch still lingered in Ethan's ears when he realized the horses wouldn't survive another hour chained in the open storm. The snow piled higher around their flanks, and each gust of wind seemed to carry a piece of their strength away. His breath smoked into the night as he made his choice. He went back to the truck, hands burning with cold, and returned with a coil of rope and an old tarp. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The gray horse, Ash, he found himself calling it silently, kept its eyes on him as if weighing his intentions. The chestnut, Blaze, snapped at the air when he drew closer, the chains rattling against the frozen stake. Ethan crouched, moving, slow, the way his father once showed him when dealing with skittish cattle on branding day. "Easy," he whispered. "We're going somewhere warmer. Somewhere better than this." With patience born of necessity, he worked the rope gently around Ash's neck, not tight, just enough to guide. The horse flinched at first, then steadied, perhaps recognizing that this man wasn't here to harm. Blaze fought harder, rearing until the stake groaned under the strain, but Ethan didn't back away. He broke off another sliver of apple, holding it steady. Blaze hesitated, chest heaving, then lunged forward to snap it up. Their eyes met, wild against weary, and for the first time, Ethan felt the fire in that animal wasn't just fear, but survival. Step by step, he coaxed them toward the truck. The snow was knee-deep, and every movement cost him. His injured leg throbbed where the cold settled into old bone. He clenched his jaw, telling himself it was no different from those long nights years ago when he'd walked fence lines to save cattle before the frostbite set in. Ranch life had always been about endurance, like paying off a stubborn mortgage that never seemed to shrink. You just kept going because stopping wasn't an option. The truck loomed like a dark promise at the edge of the storm. He lowered the tailgate and spread the tarp across it, then turned back. Ash stepped forward first, hesitant but willing, trusting the line of Ethan's hand. Blaze balked, tossing its head, teeth bared at shadows only it seemed to see. Ethan didn't force it. Instead, he climbed into the truck bed himself, crouching low, palm open. "You're not alone," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for the horse or himself. After long minutes, Blaze made the leap, hooves clattering on metal, chains scraping like thunder. Ethan threw the tarp over both animals, tucking it against the wind as best he could. His own fingers had gone stiff, uncooperative. By the time he climbed into the driver's seat, his hands looked pale and waxy in the glow of the dash lights. He flexed them around the wheel, telling himself warmth waited ahead. The road home was nearly gone beneath the drifts. Tires spun, snow spit up in angry bursts, but the old Chevy kept crawling forward, its engine groaning like an old man getting out of bed. In the rearview mirror, the tarp billowed, revealing glimpses of gray and chestnut flanks pressed together against the cold. That image steadied him more than the coffee in his thermos could. When he finally turned into the long drive that led to his ranch, relief spread through him, though it was tempered by the sight of the barn looming in the dark. The structure was older than he was, wood-weathered and ribs of tin roof patched in places with mismatched sheets. It had stood empty since his father's time, when the last horses were sold off to cover insurance bills after the accident. Ethan had never thought to open it again, but tonight it felt less like a relic and more like a refuge. He parked as close as he dared, headlights throwing long shadows across the yard. The storm clawed at his coat as he dropped to the ground and wrestled with the tailgate. The horses shifted, restless, the chains clinking in nervous rhythm. "Almost there," he told them. He didn't know if they understood, but speaking it aloud steadied him. The barn door resisted, swollen by years of snow and neglect, but at last it gave way with a shriek of rust. Inside lay a hollow world of dust and cobwebs, old hay scattered across the floor, the faint smell of animals long gone. The space felt both foreign and familiar, like entering a room you once lived in but barely recognized now. He led Ash down carefully, murmuring with each step, until the horse's hooves met solid ground. Blaze followed reluctantly, jerking against the rope until, at last, it too entered the barn. Ethan closed the door, shutting out the roar of the storm. Quiet dropped around them, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of breath, his and theirs. The horses stood side by side, steam rising from their bodies, their ribs visible beneath wet coats. He spread what hay he could find, coaxing them toward it, then filled a bucket with snow to melt into water. In the dim light, Ethan leaned against a post and watched them. Ash lowered its head to the hay, chewing slow, deliberate. Blaze kept glancing at the door, ears twitching with each gust that rattled the tin roof. Their movements filled the barn with a strange sense of presence, as though life itself had returned to walls that had long forgotten it. Exhaustion dragged at Ethan, but beneath it ran something sharper, a pulse of meaning he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his late wife, how she once told him that purpose could be as small as keeping another creature alive. Looking at Ash and Blaze, he wondered if she had known somehow that he'd need those words tonight. He lowered himself onto a pile of straw, stretching his legs out stiffly. "You're safe now," he whispered, though the storm outside roared its protest. The gray horse flicked an ear, the chestnut shifted closer to its companion, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle in his bones. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just passing through the night. He was keeping something alive within it. The barn had grown quiet in the hours since Ethan first led them inside. The storm's howl outside was still fierce, but the thick wooden walls muted it, leaving only the faint rattle of the roof and the steady rhythm of animal breath. Ethan sat on a wooden crate, his body aching from the cold and the effort, his hands raw where the rope had burned against his skin. His gaze wandered from the shadows in the rafters down to the two horses standing only yards away, their eyes glinting in the lantern light. He knew they were far from safe. The chains still clung to their legs like cruel reminders, and their ribs pressed against their coats in a way that spoke of long neglect. But for tonight, at least, they were sheltered. The thought should have been enough. Yet something restless gnawed at him, because shelter wasn't the same as trust. And without trust, none of them would survive what lay ahead. Ethan remembered a lesson his father once gave him when he was barely 12, helping break a colt that had wandered too close to their fence line. "A horse can smell your fear before you even move," his father had said, palm outstretched, letting the animal decide whether to approach. "You don't take their trust. You wait for them to hand it to you." It was the kind of wisdom that had lingered in Ethan's bones, even when he thought he'd forgotten everything else. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last apple he had taken from the cabin. It was bruised from the journey, but its scent cut through the musty air with a sweetness that felt like summer. He sliced it with his pocket knife, hands shaking slightly, and held out a piece in his open palm. He didn't move closer. He simply waited. Ash, the gray horse, was the first to notice. Its ears pricked forward, head tilting as though calculating. Slowly, cautiously, it took a step closer, hooves crunching softly on the old hay. Ethan held his breath. The distance closed inch by inch until Ash's muzzle hovered just above his hand. For a long moment, the horse only breathed, the warmth of it seeping into Ethan's skin, the sound filling the hollow spaces inside him. Then, with delicate precision, Ash's lips brushed the apple from his palm. The sound of teeth sinking into fruit rang clear, sharp, undeniable. Ethan swallowed hard, something tightening in his throat. He let his other hand rise slowly, brushing along the side of Ash's neck. The horse flinched but didn't move away. Its coat was coarse beneath his fingers, damp with melted snow, but the contact sent a wave of heat through him that no fire could match. "That's it," he whispered. "We're figuring this out." Blaze was another story. The chestnut tossed its head, eyes wide, muscles twitching with every movement. When Ethan held out a slice for it, the horse lunged forward suddenly, teeth snapping. He jerked his hand back just in time, heart pounding. The apple piece fell to the ground, where Blaze stomped it into the straw as if in defiance. The wildness in its eyes was different from Ash's measured calm. It was the wildness of a creature that had been taught only to fight. Ethan didn't blame it. He knew what it was to fight invisible chains. He had lived with his own for years now. The accident that had ended his rodeo days, the long hospital stays where healthcare bills stacked higher than fence posts, the empty bed after his wife passed. Grief had taught him that people, like horses, reacted differently to pain. Some drew inward, like Ash, while others lashed out, like Blaze. He didn't press. Instead, he leaned back, letting the apple rest in his hand, waiting. Minutes stretched out. The lantern flickered, shadows moving across the barn's walls like old memories. Finally, Blaze took a hesitant step forward, nostrils flaring. It didn't take the apple, but it didn't retreat either. And that, Ethan thought, was enough for tonight. He rose, joints aching, and spread fresh straw near them, giving the horses a softer place to stand. As he worked, Ash edged closer, watching him with calm, curious eyes. Blaze circled once, restless, but then stopped near its companion, as though drawing strength from the gray horse's quiet courage. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. He lowered himself back onto the crate, exhaustion pressing down on him. Through the cracks in the roof, moonlight spilled across the barn, silvering the straw and casting the horses in a glow that made them look less like victims and more like spirits of the land itself. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of their breathing anchor him. For the first time in years, sleep came not as an enemy, but as a companion. And in that stillness, with an apple's sweetness lingering in the air, and the weight of two living beings sharing his space, Ethan realized something had shifted. The night was still cold, the storm still fierce, the future still uncertain. But a door had opened, not of wood or iron, but of trust. And once opened, it was harder to close. Morning arrived reluctantly, dragging pale light across the Wyoming plains. The storm had loosened its grip, though the cold still pressed sharp as nails through every crack in the barn. Ethan stirred awake on the crate, his body stiff from straw and stone-hard sleep. The lantern had gone out hours ago, leaving only the glow of a thin sun through weathered boards. He sat up, joints popping, and saw Ash and Blaze watching him. Their eyes followed his every move, two pairs of questions he didn't yet know how to answer. The crunch of boots in the snow startled him. He rose quickly, heart thumping, half expecting trouble. But when the barn door creaked open, it wasn't a ranch hand or some stranger from town. It was Sophie Harper, the neighbor's 12-year-old daughter, bundled in a wool coat too big for her and a scarf the color of Wyoming earth wrapped twice around her neck. Her cheeks glowed red from the cold, eyes wide with curiosity. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, breath spilling into the barn like smoke. "My mom said you were out here during the storm." "I brought these." In her arms, she carried a bundle, a folded blanket, and a small sack of carrots. The earnestness of it, the way she hugged the bundle like it was treasure, stopped Ethan from sending her away. He cleared his throat, unsure. "You shouldn't be out in this weather, Sophie." She only shrugged. "They looked cold." Her gaze slipped past him to the horses. Ash lifted its head, ears twitching. Blaze stamped once, muscles taut but did not rear. Sophie's eyes widened further. "They're beautiful," she whispered, the kind of whisper that carries more reverence than a shout. Ethan hesitated, then took the blanket from her arms. "Thank you." He wanted to say more, but found words clumsy, like boots too big for his feet. Instead, he spread the blanket across a drafty gap in the boards, slowing the icy wind. The barn warmed a fraction. Sophie crouched, holding a carrot out on her palm. Blaze's ears flicked back, nostrils flaring, and Ethan stepped forward to stop her. But Ash moved first. With a cautious grace, the gray horse approached, sniffed the offering, and took it gently. Sophie's face lit with a smile that filled the barn brighter than sunlight. Blaze paced at the edge, restless, but its eyes darted from Ash to Sophie and back, as if trying to decide whether trust could be borrowed second-hand. Ethan watched, something loosening in his chest. He hadn't planned to involve anyone else. The fewer who knew, the safer. But there was something in the way Sophie moved. Unhurried, fearless, gentle, that the horses responded to. Blaze's agitation softened. The chain on its leg rattled once, then stilled. "You've done this before?" Ethan asked quietly. Sophie shook her head, the scarf slipping sideways. "No, I just like them. My grandpa used to say horses understand when you don't pretend." She reached slowly to stroke Ash's neck, fingers brushing coarse hair. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into her touch. Blaze snorted, as if jealous, but did not strike out. For a long while, they stayed like that. A man, a girl, and two half-wild horses bound together by silence. The barn seemed to breathe easier with them, its timbers less strained, its shadows less heavy. Ethan studied Sophie, the way her eyes softened when Ash nuzzled her palm. It reminded him of another child's eyes, his daughter's, lost years ago to a roadside accident he rarely let himself recall. The resemblance cut deep, but instead of reopening wounds, it brought a strange kind of balm. "You should go home soon," Ethan said at last, voice rough. "Your mother will worry." Sophie rose, brushing straw from her knees. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "Just to bring more carrots." Ethan hesitated. He should have said no. Too many risks, too many questions he wasn't ready to answer. But Ash nickered softly, and Blaze stilled its pacing, and the barn, for once, felt less like a burden and more like a beginning. He found himself nodding. "Tomorrow, then." Sophie's smile widened, bright as the first thaw of spring. She pulled her scarf tighter, the earth-colored wool catching in the light, and hurried toward the door. Snow swallowed the sound of her boots as she disappeared into the morning. Ethan stood there, blanket dust on his hands, watching the place where she'd been. Ash shook its mane, Blaze snorted once, and the barn returned to its quiet rhythm. But Ethan knew it wasn't the same. Something had shifted again, not just between him and the horses, but within the hollow space he carried each day. It wasn't filled, not yet, but for the first time, he sensed it might be possible. The barn smelled different in daylight, not just of dust and hay, but of something sharper, a faint metallic tang that clung to the air like a warning. Ethan knelt beside Ash, running his calloused fingers gently along the horse's legs. Beneath the damp coat, he felt the ridges, raised lines etched into the skin where chains had bitten deep. When he lifted his hand, the scent of rust lingered on his skin. He stared at it, unsettled, as though cruelty itself could leave a stain no water could wash away. Blaze shifted nearby, hooves restless, tail lashing against the cold air. The chestnut's body bore its own stories, patches where hair had rubbed thin, a raw scrape along the flank, scars that weren't from wild thickets or barbed fences, but from something deliberate. Ethan straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. Whoever had left them here hadn't just abandoned them. They had bound them, broken them down, and walked away as if their lives were nothing more than tools discarded. Sophie arrived just before noon, cheeks flushed from her walk, scarf trailing snowflakes. She carried another bundle of carrots, along with a small pail of oats she'd begged from her mother's pantry. Ethan opened his mouth to tell her she shouldn't have, but the words died when he saw the way Blaze's ears flicked forward at her voice. For a horse that trusted nothing, that was no small thing. As she set the pail down, Sophie wrinkled her nose. "It smells like old pennies in here." Ethan looked at her, startled. "That's the chains," he said, softer than he intended. He hadn't meant to put that weight on her, but Sophie's gaze was steady, older than her years. She crouched, brushing her fingers across the straw where bits of rust had fallen. "Who would do that?" she asked. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because he had too many. Instead, he busied himself with adjusting the blanket over a drafty wall, buying time, listening to the quiet sounds of chewing behind him. Later that afternoon, Sophie lingered, her words tumbling out in the offhand way of children who think they're not saying anything important. I heard something in town. At the feed store. Men talking about horses getting rounded up before the storm. They laughed about how no one would notice a few gone missing. She glanced at Ethan, wide-eyed, as though unsure if repeating it had been a mistake. The barn seemed colder all at once. Ethan's hand stilled on the rope he'd been coiling. Images surfaced unbidden. Padlocks gleaming, chains driven into frozen earth, the smell of rust clinging like smoke. He had wanted to believe this was just misfortune, some cruel accident. But accidents didn't leave marks in patterns, didn't line up padlocks like soldiers standing at attention. He let the rope fall to the ground, the thud dull against the wood. Sophie watched him carefully, sensing the shift. "Is it bad?" she asked. He forced himself to meet her eyes. "It's not good." That was all he allowed, though the rest pressed heavy against his chest. He wasn't ready to say the words aloud, not yet. But the seed had been planted, and like winter wheat beneath snow, it would grow whether he wished it or not. Ash nudged him gently as he rose, the weight of its head solid against his arm. Blaze followed, restless but near. Their presence anchored him, even as unease clawed at the back of his mind. He stroked Ash's neck, feeling the warmth, the steady beat of life that refused to be extinguished. "You're safe here," he murmured, though he knew safety was a fragile promise. That night, long after Sophie had gone home and the lantern had burned low, Ethan sat alone in the barn. The metallic scent was still there, sharp and unyielding. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the phantom bite of chains. For years, he had thought the worst cruelties were behind him. The rodeo accident, the empty house, the slow ache of loneliness. But looking at Ash and Blaze, he understood cruelty wasn't just behind him. It had walked into his barn and settled at his feet. And he knew then, whoever had done this might not be finished. The storm had eased, but the cold pressed harder in its stillness, the kind that gnawed at bones rather than skin. Ethan sat on the straw-strewn floor of the barn, lantern burning low, its light carving long shadows that swayed with every flicker. Ash and Blaze moved restlessly, unsettled by some unease that had no name. Ethan knew it wasn't just them. The unease lived in him, too, pulsing like an old wound that never quite healed. Blaze had been pacing for an hour, circling the stall, hooves pounding against the wood like fists on a locked door. Ethan had tried offering hay, water, even his presence. Nothing calmed the horse. When Sophie slipped in earlier that evening with another bundle of carrots, Blaze had lunged so suddenly that the girl nearly stumbled. Ethan had shouted. Too loud, too sharp. And the look in Sophie's eyes as she backed toward the door had cut deeper than he expected. She left quickly, scarf trailing, her silence heavier than the snow outside. Now Blaze snorted, throwing its head, and in one violent motion knocked over the bucket of water. It clattered across the boards, spilling into the cracks. Ethan's patience cracked with it. He surged to his feet, voice breaking against the rafters. "Enough!" His words echoed, startling even Ash. He hadn't meant to roar, but it poured out, years of bottled grief and fatigue riding his voice. "I can't do this. Not again." Not lose something else. The horses froze, eyes wide, ears flicking at the tremor in his tone. Ethan pressed his palms against his face, fingers digging into his skin as though he could claw the memories out. His daughter's laugh, high and bright, swallowed by the screech of tires. His wife's hand, pale in the hospital bed, slipping from his grasp no matter how hard he held on. The silence of an empty house where only unpaid bills and folded photographs remained. His knees gave out, dropping him to the straw. "I can't save you," he whispered, breath jagged. "I wasn't able to save them. And I'm terrified I'll fail you too." His words tangled with the quiet, half-confession, half-prayer, and then a weight pressed against him, unexpected, grounding. Ash had stepped forward, lowering its head until its muzzle rested against his shoulder. The warmth of it seeped through his coat, steady and calm, as if to say there was no judgment in the barn tonight, only presence. Ethan let out a sound he hadn't made in years, not since the funeral. A broken sob, raw and unhidden. Blaze, still tense, snorted and pawed at the ground, but its circling slowed. It watched Ash lean into the man, ears tilting, muscles quivering as if torn between fear and understanding. Ethan lifted his hand, trembling, and laid it on Ash's neck. The horse didn't flinch. It stood, a sentinel of patience, allowing him to empty grief into silence. The lantern sputtered, shadows bending. Ethan's tears fell into straw that smelled of rust and hay. "I'm scared," he admitted aloud, his voice smaller now. "Scared of giving what I don't know if I still have. Scared of watching something I love vanish again." Ash exhaled softly, warm breath rising in clouds. Blaze inched closer, one cautious step at a time, not yet ready to touch, but not pulling away either. The barn held its breath. For the first time, Ethan didn't fight the stillness. He let it hold him. The storm outside had passed, but inside a different storm had broken and settled into quiet. Ash's steady weight reminded him that even shattered things could find balance. He pressed his forehead lightly against the horse's coat, closing his eyes. For years, Ethan had carried his losses like chains. Tonight, for one fragile moment, he allowed someone, something else to carry part of it with him. Morning came sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that makes wood creak like it's remembering every winter before. Ethan was still on the barn floor when a knock rattled against the doorframe. He rose slowly, brushing straw from his coat, expecting Sophie with her scarf and stubborn questions. But it wasn't Sophie. Dr. Harper stood there, hat dusted with frost, his old leather bag hanging from one hand. "Your neighbor called," the doctor said, stepping inside with a nod. "Said you might need another set of eyes." Ethan stiffened, caught between gratitude and unease. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't wanted the circle of people who knew about Ash and Blaze to widen. But Harper had been part of this land longer than most. An old ranch doctor who stitched calves, treated ranch hands, and delivered half the children in the valley. His presence carried the quiet authority of someone who knew survival came from small, careful acts. The horses shifted at the intrusion. Blaze stamped hard, ears pinned, while Ash watched warily, but did not back away. Harper set down his bag and crouched, movements slow, deliberate, as though approaching royalty rather than half-wild animals. "Easy now," he murmured, voice calm as creek water. "I'm just looking." Ethan hovered nearby, torn between stepping in and letting the man work. Harper opened the bag, the familiar smell of antiseptic rising, a scent Ethan hadn't breathed since hospital corridors where bills had mounted higher than hope. The memory tugged at him, but he forced it down, focusing on the horses instead. The doctor began with Ash, brushing back the coarse hair to study the raw lines cut by chains. He cleaned each mark with careful hands, dabbing with warm water and salve. Ash twitched, but stood still, eyes flicking once toward Ethan, as though asking if this was all right. Ethan stepped closer, resting his palm against the horse's shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. The words anchored him as much as they steadied Ash. Blaze was another matter. The chestnut pulled against the rope, snorting and lashing its tail. Harper didn't push. He sat back on his heels, patient, letting the horse circle the stall in nervous arcs. "This one's seen more than its share," he said quietly, not looking at Ethan but speaking as if to the air itself. "You can't rush what's been broken." Ethan nodded, throat tight. He knew the truth of that better than anyone. After a long while, Blaze stopped pacing. Its flanks trembled, breath heavy in the cold air. Harper moved again, slower this time, offering nothing but presence. When he finally touched the horse's leg, Blaze flinched, but didn't strike. Ethan let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Together they worked to clean the wounds, Harper guiding, Ethan steadying with words more than hands. When it was done, Harper rose, brushing straw from his knees. "They'll need time," he said. "Feed, warmth, patience, nothing fancy. You've given them a chance. That's more than most." His eyes, lined deep with years, held Ethan's for a long moment. "But be careful. Horses like these, someone might come looking." The words hung heavy. Ethan didn't ask how much Harper knew. He simply nodded, because deep down he'd already felt the same shadow. As the doctor packed his bag, Sophie appeared at the door, scarf askew, cheeks red from running. She froze at the sight of Harper, but quickly smiled, as if relieved the barn had grown bigger with kindness. She hurried to Blaze, speaking softly, and for the first time the chestnut didn't back away at once. It sniffed her scarf. Eyes still, sharp, but didn't turn aside. "See?" Sophie said, glancing back at Ethan. "They're learning." Ethan wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that small signs could outweigh the heavy truth of scars and chains. He thanked Harper, words clumsy but sincere, and watched the doctor walk back into the morning, his figure swallowed by pale light and drifting snow. In the barn, Ash shifted closer, Blaze still on edge, but quieter than the night before. Sophie sat cross-legged on the straw, humming a tune that didn't belong to any song Ethan recognized. It was soft, uneven, but the horses listened. Ethan leaned against the post, exhaustion threading through him, and let the moment settle like dust after a storm. For now, the doctor's hands had given them relief, but his warning lingered, echoing louder than the silence that followed. Someone might come looking. Snow had fallen steady through the night, softening the world into silence. When Ethan stepped out of the cabin that morning, the drifts reached the tops of his boots, powder crunching beneath every step. He carried a small bundle of oats and a bucket of melted water for the horses, his breath rising in clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. The air was sharp, brittle, as though it might shatter if he spoke too loud. At the barn door, something caught his eye. A corner of paper, damp with frost, had been wedged beneath the wood. He bent to pick it up, the chill biting into his fingers as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, too neat, careful strokes pressed into the page by someone who wanted to appear polite. The message was brief. "Return what isn't yours. No one needs to get hurt." Ethan stared at the words until the snow began to blur the ink. His pulse kicked hard in his throat. He glanced toward the horizon, the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of his property. Everything looked ordinary. White fields, bare branches, a hawk circling high above. But the paper in his hand told another story. Someone had been close enough to leave it. Inside the barn, Ash lifted its head as he entered, ears swiveling toward him. Blaze stamped once, nostrils flaring as if it sensed the unease carried on his shoulders. Ethan tucked the note into his coat, forcing his voice steady as he set down the feed. "Nothing to worry about," he murmured, though the lie rang hollow even to him. Sophie arrived later that morning, her scarf trailing loose. She noticed his stiffness right away. "Something wrong?" she asked, brushing snow from her boots before crossing to the horses. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to shield her, to keep her in the innocence that seemed to come so naturally to her. But she was sharper than her years, and silence would only invite more questions. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and handed it over. Sophie read it once, eyes narrowing. "Who would write this?" she asked. "Someone who thinks they own them," Ethan said. His voice came out, harsher than he meant, bitterness scraping the words. Sophie frowned, glancing at Ash and Blaze. "But they left them to die." "I know." The barn grew heavy with that truth. Ethan busied himself with checking Blaze's wound, though his hands moved more forcefully than usual. Blaze tossed its head, reacting to the tension in him. He forced himself to slow, murmuring apologies, until the horse stilled. That afternoon, Ethan saddled his truck and drove into town. He told Sophie to stay behind, though her eyes followed him with worry. At the feed store, conversation hummed low. Men gathered around the stove swapping rumors. Ethan caught fragments. 2 horses missing. Storm changed everything. Worth good money if they're trained right. None of the voices carried guilt, just casual greed. On his way out, old Mrs. Green pressed a bundle of extra hay into his hands. "You've been working harder than most this winter," she said. Her kindness nearly undid him. It reminded him that the town was not just whispers and threats. There were still good people, still places where decency lived. Back at the ranch, twilight draped itself across the fields. Sophie was waiting, scarf pulled high against her chin. She didn't ask what he'd learned. She didn't need to. She simply walked beside him into the barn, where Ash nickered softly at their arrival. Blaze stood close, restless but not wild, watching with sharp eyes. Ethan fed them in silence, the note heavy in his pocket like a stone. Sophie hummed under her breath, the same uneven tune she'd carried before, and for a moment the barn felt safe again. But when the wind rattled the walls, Ethan's hand went instinctively to his coat, fingers brushing the folded paper. The message had been clear. Someone wanted the horses back. And deep in his gut, Ethan knew they would come looking sooner rather than later. The sky was pale when Ethan woke, a thin ribbon of light stretching above the horizon, painting the snowfields in muted silver. Sleep had been shallow, broken by every creak of the barn walls, every gust that rattled loose shingles. He had kept the folded note on the table beside his bed, its words echoing louder in the dark than the storm ever could. By morning, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Sheriff Daniels answered on the second ring. His voice carried the slow cadence of a man used to hearing more trouble than triumph. "Miller? You don't call much these days." Ethan gripped the receiver tighter. "Found something on my property." A note. He hesitated, then read the words aloud. Silence followed, broken only by the faint static of the line. "You think it's connected to those horses?" Daniels asked finally. I don't think, Ethan replied. I know. His voice had grown sharper overnight, carved by the thought of strangers creeping onto his land. The sheriff exhaled audibly. I'll drive out tomorrow. Bring the papers I've got on livestock. Disputes. See if there's any match. Till then, keep quiet. No need to stir talk until we've got something solid. Ethan hung up, unease heavier than before. He had hoped for certainty, some assurance that law could shield what was fragile under his roof. Instead, he felt the hollow truth. Papers, rules, and distance couldn't cover everything. Not in a county where winter storms closed roads and silence carried farther than help. When he stepped into the barn, Ash lifted its head, nickering softly. Blaze pawed at the straw, ears back, as though it had overheard the conversation itself. Ethan crouched near them, running a hand down Ash's neck. They'll be here tomorrow, he murmured, though the words were more for himself than the horses. Until then, it's just us. The day stretched long. Sophie appeared with her scarf tucked tighter than usual, carrying a tin of biscuits her mother had insisted she share. She noticed Ethan's drawn face, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing against more than cold. Did something happen? She asked, setting the tin down. Ethan hesitated, then told her in fragments, about the note, about calling Daniels, about the promise of papers. Sophie listened, wide-eyed, then squared her shoulders with surprising firmness. So we wait, she said simply. But waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Her words lingered after she left, the scarf's earthy color flashing once before the snow swallowed her. Ethan fed the horses in measured silence, thinking of how waiting was never still. Waiting was work. It was shoveling paths through drifts, patching leaks in a roof, keeping breath in lungs when storms pressed down. That evening, he sat at the table by the window, lantern flickering against the glass. Beyond, the land stretched wide and white, a canvas where any shadow could step uninvited. He thought of the sheriff's papers, of men in town speaking casually of horses as if they were coins to be pocketed. He thought of the note beneath his door, the ink pressed too carefully. And as the wind rose again, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow might bring answers, but tonight, vigilance belonged only to him. By the time the sheriff's promised visit loomed, word had already slipped through the valley the way smoke seeps through a cracked chimney. No one said outright what they knew, but neighbors in a place like this had a way of listening between silences. Ethan felt it most acutely the next afternoon when he pulled his truck into town. At the feed store, Mrs. Green stood waiting, her gray hair tucked under a wool cap. Without explanation, she loaded 2 small bales of hay into his truck bed, her breath puffing in white bursts. For your trouble, she said, though her eyes carried something more, a quiet understanding, the kind that didn't demand names or reasons. From the post office, Mr. Laramie handed him a sack of oats, muttering about surplus stock at the gas station. A young mechanic who barely knew Ethan beyond polite nods slipped him a jar of honey from his family's hives. Every gesture was small, practical, but strung together they formed a net stronger than any law. Ethan drove home with his truck heavier than when he'd left. The weight measured not just in supplies, but in unseen loyalty. Back at the barn, Sophie was already waiting. Scarf tucked loosely this time, a grin bright against the cold. You've been busy, she teased as he hauled the hay inside. She crouched beside Ash, offering a carrot slice, and the gray horse leaned down with easy trust. Blaze circled once, then stepped closer, sniffing at the new hay with cautious approval. They don't even know, Sophie said, watching the horses. "And still they help." Ethan nodded, though his throat tightened. He had always thought of the valley as a place where people minded their own. Now he saw the truth. They minded their own by minding each other. In winters that stretched cruel, no one survived alone. That night, Ethan spread the hay fresh across the stalls. Ash lowered its head immediately, chewing with calm rhythm. Blaze sniffed, testing, then bent to eat as well. The sound filled the barn, warm and steady, like rain falling on a roof. Ethan leaned against the post, letting the rhythm seep into him. He hadn't realized how much he needed the sound of contentment, how healing it could be. Later, as Sophie packed up to leave, she lingered at the door. "It feels different now," she said. Ethan glanced around the barn, the patched walls, the new hay, the horses shifting quietly in the straw. "It is different," he answered. But he also knew the note in his pocket had not vanished. Kindness was real, but so was danger. Both lived side by side, like fire and frost. When Sophie disappeared into the twilight, Ethan lingered a while longer with the horses. Ash nickered softly, and Blaze lifted its head, eyes catching the lantern glow. For the first time, Blaze did not shy when Ethan stepped closer. He reached out, hand steady, and though the horse didn't yet accept the touch, it also didn't retreat. A space had closed, just a little. As he left the barn, lantern swinging at his side, Ethan looked back once more. The light glowed against the wooden walls, spilling warmth into the night. The valley was full of quiet watchers, neighbors who offered hay and honey instead of questions. For now, that would be enough. But beneath the gratitude, Ethan carried an edge of vigilance sharper than any winter wind. Because generosity, however welcome, could not erase the truth. Someone else out there wanted Ash and Blaze, and they would not bring hay when they came. The sky had turned the color of pewter, a low lid pressing down on the valley. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy with silence, the kind that made every sound carry farther than it should. Ethan was repairing a warped stall door when he noticed the absence. Sophie's scarf, usually a streak of earthy wool against the snow, was missing from the yard. She had been around only moments ago, humming while she brushed hay from Blaze's mane. Now the barn was too quiet. He stepped outside, scanning the yard. Fresh snow stretched smooth, unbroken, until he caught sight of faint indentations leading toward the rise where the cottonwoods grew. Sophie's footprints. Small, hurried, drifting off toward the gully. His chest tightened. The land was deceptively gentle under its blanket of white. A child could lose her bearings in less than a minute. Before he could move, Ash lifted its head sharply, ears pricked. Blaze snorted, restless, circling in tight arcs. The two horses fixed their gaze on the same direction, the line of trees where Sophie's prints vanished. Ethan felt the prickle at the back of his neck. They knew. He dropped the hammer, grabbed his coat, and flung open the stall door. Ash surged forward first, Blaze close behind, hooves striking the snow with a rhythm urgent and sure. Ethan followed, breath hard in his throat, his boots sinking deep as he struggled to keep pace. The horses cut a path ahead of him, plumes of snow bursting with every stride. At the edge of the gully, Sophie sat huddled on a low branch, her scarf caught in the brambles, cheeks pale with cold. She looked up, eyes wide, as Ash reached her first, lowering its head as if to shield her. Blaze circled once, snorting clouds, before standing guard. Ethan stumbled to her side, relief flooding so quickly it left him dizzy. "You all right?" he asked, dropping to his knees in the snow. She nodded quickly, though her voice trembled. "I slipped. I couldn't find my way back." He freed her scarf from the thorns, wrapping it tighter around her neck. For a moment he simply held her there, his breath mingling with hers in clouds of white. Then he glanced at the horses. Ash stood steady, Blaze restless but near, their presence not just coincidence. They had led him here. On the walk back, Sophie leaned against him, steps unsteady. Ash and Blaze flanked them like sentinels, one calm, the other fierce, but both unwavering. Ethan felt the truth of it settle in his bones. This was no longer only about sheltering two animals. This was about trust that ran both directions. Back in the barn, he spread fresh blankets over the straw and coaxed Sophie to sit near the lantern. Blaze hovered close, nostrils flaring as if counting her breaths. Ash lowered its head until it brushed her shoulder, a gesture so gentle it drew tears to Ethan's eyes. "See?" Sophie whispered, voice cracking. They knew. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick. He had always believed in hard work, in fences mended and debts repaid. But this quiet communion between child and horse, between man and the creatures he had almost lost in the storm, this was something else. Something that couldn't be measured in money or explained by reason. Later, when Sophie had gone home, Ethan remained in the barn. The horses shifted, restless from the day's events, but calmer than before. He reached out, brushing his hand against Blaze's flank. For once, the horse did not recoil. Instead, it stood still, ears tilted back toward him. Ash, steady as ever, leaned closer. Ethan let the silence swell around them, no longer oppressive, but filled with a fragile promise. The snow outside might still hide threats, the note in his pocket still waited unanswered, but tonight, within these walls, trust had deepened. And that trust, he thought, might be the only compass any of them had. The snow had softened overnight, settling into a thin crust that glittered beneath the morning sun. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, gloves stiff against the cold, staring at the old wooden gate that leaned outward from years of neglect. Beyond it stretched the wide pasture, rolling and white, untouched except for a few rabbit tracks that stitched across the drifts. The land looked endless, freedom drawn in pale lines. Inside the barn, Ash shifted in its stall, ears flicking toward the light spilling through the open door. Blaze pawed restlessly, tail swishing, as if the walls themselves pressed too close. Ethan could feel the pull in both of them, a hunger not just for food or shelter, but for space, for the wildness that had been chained but not erased. He reached for the latch, the metal biting his fingers even through leather. The chain that had once bound them still haunted his memory, its weight and rust etched into his palms. But this gate was different. This gate was choice. He lifted the latch and let the gate swing wide, hinges groaning against years of disuse. The sound cracked across the morning air like a challenge. For a long while, nothing happened. Ash stood poised, gaze fixed on the horizon. Blaze tossed its head, nostrils flaring, taking one tentative step toward the open yard. Ethan didn't move. He forced himself to stand still, heart heavy with contradiction. Part of him wanted to call them back, to shut the gate and lock it tight, to keep them safe in the only way he knew. But another part, quieter yet stronger, whispered that safety meant nothing without freedom. Blaze stepped onto the snow first, hooves crunching, tail high. Ash followed, deliberate, each step measured. Together they crossed the yard, approaching the open gate. Ethan's breath caught, his chest tight with the ache of inevitability. He had brought them this far, sheltered them, fed them. But perhaps they belonged to the horizon, not to him. At the threshold, Ash paused. The wind lifted its mane, silver against the white of the pasture. Blaze stopped beside it, muscles quivering, eyes bright with uncertainty. Both horses turned their heads in unison, looking back. Their gaze pinned Ethan where he stood, raw and wordless, as though waiting for him to understand what words could never hold. Minutes stretched. Long. Enough for the sun to climb higher. Long enough for frost to drip from the eaves of the barn. Then, slowly, Ash pivoted. Blaze lingered, ears twitching, then followed. Side by side, they returned across the snow, back through the gate, and into the barn as though the choice had never been in question. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His knees felt weak, but he forced himself upright, closing the gate softly, though not latching it this time. It swung gently in the breeze, no longer a barrier, but a reminder. Trust wasn't about fences. Trust was about return. Inside, Sophie was perched on a bale of hay, watching with wide eyes. "They came back," she whispered, as if afraid her voice might shatter the moment. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for words. Ash nudged his shoulder, Blaze shook its mane and snorted, and the barn filled with the sound of belonging. He pressed his hand to Ash's neck, then to Blaze's, the warmth of both steady against his palms. That night, long after Sophie had gone home and the lantern had burned low, Ethan walked once more to the gate. Snow glowed under the moon, stretching endless and silent. He left the gate open, just a crack, and turned away. Behind him, he heard Ash shift, Blaze snort, and then nothing but quiet. They were still inside. Still his, for now. The sheriff arrived late in the morning, his truck grinding up the icy drive, tires throwing pale sprays of snow. Beside him rode a man Ethan didn't recognize, a state inspector with a clipboard tucked under his arm. They parked near the barn, boots crunching heavily as they crossed the yard. Ethan felt the weight of their presence long before they reached the door. Daniels nodded in greeting, his face lined deeper than usual from the cold. "Morning, Miller. Thought we'd take a look." His voice was calm, steady, but carried the authority of someone who had seen more disputes than he cared to count. Ethan opened the barn doors, and the smell of hay and hoarse warmth spilled out against the winter air. Ash raised its head at once, ears twitching. Blaze stood further back, restless but not wild, eyes sharp with suspicion. The inspector stepped in carefully, his boots sinking into straw. He adjusted his glasses, gaze narrowing as he studied the animals. "They've been through something," he said simply, kneeling beside Ash. His fingers traced the faint ridges around the horse's fetlocks, the scars where chains had once bitten deep. He scribbled notes on his clipboard, the scratch of pen loud in the quiet. Blaze tossed its head, snorting, but did not move away when the man stepped closer. That, more than anything, told Ethan how far they'd come. Daniels leaned against a post, watching. "Paperwork's already in motion. We've got one claim filed. Says 2 horses fitting this description went missing before the storm. But," he let the word hang, heavy as the breath that steamed from his mouth. "What you've shown me here doesn't line up with someone who cares for their property." Ethan folded his arms, jaw set. "They weren't property the night I found them." The inspector glanced up from his notes. "Still, there will be hearings. Evidence, and men who think ownership is just about signatures and stamps." He closed the clipboard with a sharp snap, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "But scars tell their own story. These marks, no court can unsee them." Ash shifted closer to Ethan, brushing against his shoulder. Blaze circled once, then stilled, eyes fixed on the inspector as if weighing judgment of its own. Sophie, who had slipped in quietly during the visit, crouched low with her scarf bundled at her chin, watching every movement. Her gaze burned brighter than the lantern hanging above them. Daniels cleared his throat. "Keep them safe, Miller. Until this sorts itself, you may be asked more questions, maybe more visits. Not everyone will come with papers." His eyes flicked briefly to the horizon, where the snowfield stretched wide and empty. Ethan understood the unspoken warning. Threats weren't always written down. When they left, the barn felt both lighter and heavier at once. Sophie crept from her corner, eyes wide. "They're not taking them, are they?" Ethan shook his head. "Not today." His voice carried both relief and caution. He walked to the horses, running a hand down Ash's neck, then resting it against Blaze's flank. The warmth of them steadied him. He thought of the inspector's words, "Scars tell their own story," and felt a flicker of strength he hadn't known was still inside him. Outside, the sheriff's truck rumbled down the drive, leaving behind only tracks in the snow. Inside, Ethan stood with Ash and Blaze, Sophie watching quietly, and knew that from now on, the truth of who these horses were and what had been done to them would not just be his burden. It would be a story the land itself carried, written into every scar that no paper could erase. The weeks turned, and the valley shifted almost without notice. The drifts that once towered above the fences sagged into softer mounds, their edges darkening where earth pressed upward. Icicles dripped in slow rhythm, marking time against the eaves of the barn. Ethan shoveled paths daily, the work steady and grounding, though each morning the snow returned in lighter veils. It no longer felt like a prison, but like a season preparing to let go. Inside the barn, Ash's coat grew glossier, the dullness of neglect replaced by a sheen that caught the lantern light. Blaze still carried fire in its step, but the wildness no longer came from panic. It had settled into something fiercer, protective, almost watchful. Ethan noticed the difference each time he entered, the way Blaze no longer retreated, the way Ash leaned into his hand with quiet trust. Their presence filled the space as if they had always belonged. Sophie came often, sometimes with nothing, more than a smile and her scarf trailing behind her. One evening, she appeared with ribbon tucked in her pocket, worn from her mother's sewing basket. She coaxed Blaze to stand still, humming under her breath, and wove the ribbon gently into its mane. The horse tossed its head once, almost playful, before settling again. When the ribbon slipped free moments later, Sophie only laughed, fingers loosening the strands. "It doesn't matter if it stays," she said. "It just matters that it was there for a while." Ethan watched, struck by the simplicity of her words. He thought of his wife's handwriting on old grocery lists still pinned to the fridge, of his daughter's drawings folded in a drawer, marks of presents that didn't need to last forever to mean something. The ribbon, brief and bright, was enough. With the thaw came work. Ethan repaired the sagging roof, hammering new boards where rot had crept in. He cleared out decades-old tools, brushing dust from rusted hinges, setting aside what could be mended. The barn began to breathe again, not just as shelter, but as home. He imagined pasture grass greening in spring, imagined Ash and Blaze running without chains, and felt a stir of hope that frightened him with its sharpness. One afternoon, Dr. Harper stopped by with a tin of salve and a quiet smile. "They're healing well," he said after examining the scars. "Better than I expected." He tapped Blaze's shoulder gently, meeting Ethan's eye. "And so are you." Ethan said nothing, but the words rooted deep. That evening, as the last of the light sank behind the mountains, Ethan stood at the open barn door. The sky bled orange into violet, clouds edged with gold. Ash grazed on a patch of exposed earth near the fence line, Blaze beside it, tails swishing in unison. Sophie leaned against the gate, her scarf pulled low, her face softened by the glow. "It doesn't look like winter anymore," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Not the same winter, anyway." He let his hand rest on the wood of the gate, feeling the grain warm from the day's sun. For the first time in years, the season hadn't been only about endurance. It had been about change. As the stars crept out, Blaze lifted its head, ears flicking toward the darkening fields. Ash followed, steady and calm. They didn't bolt, didn't strain against invisible chains. They simply stood, watching, as though aware of a horizon beyond sight, but choosing, for now, to remain where they were. Ethan closed the barn doors gently, lantern swinging at his side. Inside, the warmth lingered, not from fire, but from presence. Snow was loosening, spring was promised, and for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to meet what came next. Spring crept into the valley quietly, not with fanfare, but with slow persistence. The snow withdrew in patches, revealing grass the color of faded emerald, brittle at first, and then softening under the touch of longer days. Cottonwoods budded, their branches tipped with green, and the sound of meltwater trickled through the gullies like a hymn. For the first time in months, Ethan left his coat unbuttoned as he carried buckets to the barn. The cold had lost its edge. Ash and Blaze greeted him with soft knickers, their coats shining now, muscles filled out from steady feed and freedom to move. Blaze no longer circled the stalls in restless defiance. Instead, it watched Ethan with an alertness that felt more like loyalty than suspicion. Ash, ever the calm one, pressed close whenever he entered, brushing its head against his shoulder in a gesture so familiar it felt like an old handshake. Sophie skipped into the yard that afternoon, her scarf tucked into a pocket, no longer needed against the softer wind. She climbed the fence rail, legs swinging, and whistled low. Both horses lifted their heads at once, trotting toward her as though drawn by a string only they could see. She laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, carrying farther than it had all winter. Ethan stood back, watching her fingers bury into Blaze's mane, Ash leaning close enough for her to rest her cheek against its neck. "See?" she called, her voice full of certainty. "They're home." The word caught Ethan unprepared. Home. It hadn't been one for so long, not since the accident, Not since the funerals, not since he'd closed himself off behind fences of silence. But now the barn smelled of hay and horse. The fields held tracks of hooves, and laughter echoed in places that had once only known echoes of grief. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe this land was home again. That evening, Ethan left the gate wide open. The pasture stretched far, green breaking through white in long ribbons. Ash and Blaze stepped into it together, manes lifted by the breeze. Sophie leaned on the gate beside Ethan, silent for once, just watching. The horses ran, not in panic, not in flight, but in joy. Their strides were long and powerful, hooves thundering against the thawing earth. Blaze tossed its head, kicking high, while Ash moved with steady grace, the two weaving around each other like threads pulled through a single cloth. Ethan felt the sound of it more than he heard it, deep, reverberating, filling him until it shook loose the weight he had carried for years. He remembered the night of the storm, the chains, the fear. He remembered the sobs muffled in straw, the confession he had spilled in the dark. And then he looked at the open field, at the two animals who had chosen to stay when they could have gone, and he realized the winter inside him had loosened too. As twilight settled, Ash and Blaze returned to the fence line, breath steaming, eyes bright. Sophie stretched out her hand, and Blaze lowered its head for her to touch. Ash moved to Ethan, pressing its muzzle into his chest with the steady insistence of trust. Ethan's hand rose, almost without thought, brushing the smooth line of its neck. "You're right," he said quietly, not sure if he spoke to Sophie, to the horses, or to the fading sky. "This is home." The wind carried his words across the field, soft and unhurried. Stars blinked awake above, scattered and kind. Sophie leaned her head against his arm. Ash stood solid against his side, and Blaze lifted its head toward the horizon as though keeping watch. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole, not because the losses had vanished, but because the present had chosen to stay. Sometimes the bonds we least expect are the ones that save us. If this story touched your heart, let me know with something simple. Just comment 0 or 1 below. Your words keep these stories alive. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next tale of courage, healing, and the unspoken bond between humans and animals is waiting for you here.